There were few things Ethan Moreau didn't control. His life was a mosaic of precision, hours mapped to the minute, meals tailored by nutritionists, meetings stacked like dominoes across time zones. The villa overlooking Lake Como stood as a monument to order, its corridors hushed, its gardens symmetrically pruned. Nothing happened in Ethan's world by chance, and that was exactly how he liked it, until the day everything unraveled, with the faint sound of music. It was a Tuesday, mid-afternoon. The light was gold, filtering through the high-arched windows of the sunroom, warming the cool marble floors. Ethan walked every day without noticing. He was returning from a call with investors in Singapore, adjusting his cufflinks as he entered the atrium. That's when he heard it. Not the chime of a phone, not the tick of a clock. Music. Ethan's body stilled. It wasn't coming from a speaker. It was alive. Notes floating, uneven, unsure, full of raw imperfection. And laughter. Laughter. He turned his head sharply toward the open courtyard. What he saw fractured something inside him. There, in the center of the courtyard's sunlit square, was his son, Lucas, 13 years old, gangly and quiet and wounded by time, twisting his limbs in rhythm to the music, not flawlessly, not with technique, but freely, dancing. Across from him was Camila Santos, the maid, but she wasn't mopping or folding linens. She was moving, teaching, her posture fluid, her steps purposeful. She didn't look like a maid. She looked like someone born to dance. And Lucas, he was laughing, not a polite chuckle, not a rare smirk. It was real, loud, free, the kind of laugh Ethan hadn't heard since his wife was alive. He blinked as if the image might reset, the way a corrupted screen does. But it didn't fade. The sight remained. Camilla turning in soft spirals, Lucas mimicking with childlike joy, their shadows spinning across the flagstone tiles like echoes of a dream Ethan didn't recognize. He stepped forward without realizing. His polished shoes struck the stones like thunder. Camilla stopped instantly. Lucas froze mid-movement, smile gone. Silence swallowed the courtyard. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "What is happening here?" he asked, each syllable crisp, deliberate. Camilla turned to him calmly. Her breathing was steady, her expression unreadable. "We were dancing," she said simply. Ethan's jaw twitched. "Why?" Lucas opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His eyes flicked to Camilla, then to the ground. "I asked her," he said finally. "I wanted to learn." Ethan's chest tightened. He wasn't sure if it was confusion, anger, or something darker, something unfamiliar. "Since when?" he asked, trying to keep the edge from his voice. Lucas shrugged. "A while." A while. How had he missed this? His own son, secretly dancing behind his back with a maid? What else had been happening in this house, his house, without his knowing? He turned to Camilla. "That's not your job." "No," she said, "it's not." "Then why?" Her eyes didn't shift. "Because he needed it." There it was again. That tone, steady, unapologetic, not rebellious, not disrespectful, just certain. Ethan felt the heat rise in his neck. He glanced at Lucas, eyes lowered, hands fidgeting. The image felt wrong, off-kilter, like looking into a family portrait and realizing one of the smiles was painted on. "I want to speak with you," Ethan said to Camilla. "Alone." Lucas's eyes widened. Camilla nodded once, turning toward the interior doors without waiting for permission. They entered the library in silence. The walls were lined with rare books Ethan never read. The desk was clean, untouched. Camilla stood near the window, her arms folded loosely, the sunlight catching the edge of her cheekbone. Ethan stayed near the door. "What are you doing with my son?" he asked. Her head tilted slightly. "Helping him find something." "Find what?" "Expression, movement, maybe even joy." Ethan laughed once, dry. "He doesn't need dance. He needs discipline." "He has discipline," Camilla said. "What he doesn't have is release." Her words struck harder than he expected. He didn't respond. Instead, he studied her. This woman who'd arrived 6 months ago. Quiet, efficient, clean resume. No red flags. She spoke little, kept to herself, did her job. And yet somehow, without permission, she had touched the one thing Ethan thought was still under control, his son. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "2 months," she said. He blinked. "2 months?" "Not every day, just when he asks." Ethan's thoughts swirled. 2 months? How had he not noticed? How had Lucas hidden it so well? Or maybe he hadn't been hiding. Maybe Ethan hadn't been looking. "I hired you to manage the house," Ethan said. "Not parent my child." "I'm not parenting him," Camilla replied. "I'm listening." That word, listening. It felt like a slap, because deep down he knew he hadn't truly listened to Lucas in years. He had spoken to him, directed him, provided for him, but listened, not once. "Why dance?" Ethan asked, softer this time. Camilla looked toward the garden. "Because it's how I survived," she said. Ethan said nothing. The room held its breath. Finally, she turned back to him. "He needed someone to move with him. I did nothing more than respond to that need." "And what do you get out of it?" Camilla hesitated. Then softly, "Hope." Ethan stared at her, unsure what he was seeing. Not defiance, not manipulation, just truth. He suddenly felt foolish, like a king discovering a stranger had planted a garden inside his castle, and the flowers were better than anything he'd ever grown. He wanted to be angry, but he couldn't. Not when the image of Lucas laughing still rang in his ears. Not when a maid had done something he, with all his wealth and resources, had failed to do. He sat down behind his desk, feeling the weight of something intangible settle on his shoulders. He didn't speak again for a long while. Camilla stood silently, waiting, and Ethan, for the first time in years, didn't know what to say. He only knew one thing. Everything had just changed, and he had no idea where it was going, but he needed to find out. Because for the first time in a long time, something real had cracked through the surface of his perfect life, and it terrified him. But also, quietly, secretly, it thrilled him. He looked up. "I want to know who you are," he said at last. Camilla's gaze didn't shift. "Then ask." And just like that, the man who controlled everything lost control, and the story truly began. Ethan Moreau had built his empire on instinct. He knew when a deal smelled off before papers were ever drawn. He could walk into a boardroom and read a room before a single word was spoken. It was how he'd outpaced his competitors, how he'd turned moderate inheritance into a multinational investment firm, and how he had survived the chaos of markets no one else could predict. But when it came to the people inside his own home, that instinct had failed him. Camilla Santos. He had barely noticed her when she arrived. 6 months ago, her resume had been clean. No prior incidents, no gaps in employment, a few polite references, all glowing, quiet, respectful, efficient. And yet, she had somehow slipped past every wall he'd built, right into his son's world. And now he couldn't stop thinking about her. After their confrontation in the library, Ethan's mind refused to settle. Something about the way she'd stood her ground, about the sadness in her voice, it haunted him. Not in a threatening way, but like a song you half remembered from childhood, something unfinished. That night he poured a glass of wine, sat at his desk, and did what he did best. He investigated. He typed her name into the search bar, half expecting to find nothing. Camilla Santos wasn't exactly a rare name. Dozens of results. A missing woman in Mexico, a fashion blogger in Lisbon, a pastry chef in Boston. Nothing matched. But then, on the third page, something caught his eye. A headline, almost buried beneath a stack of irrelevant articles. Brazilian contemporary dance prodigy disappears from spotlight. He clicked. The article was dated 7 years ago. It featured a young woman mid-leap, her silhouette captured in a perfect arc, one arm extended toward the sky. Even through the pixelation, the face was unmistakable. It was her. Camilla. Ethan leaned in, scanning the text with the urgency of someone unlocking a secret code. She had been a rising star, a breakout performer in Rio's avant-garde contemporary scene, touted as one of the most promising dancers of her generation. By 21, she was headlining festivals in São Paulo, training with international choreographers, rumored to be en route to Paris. And then, nothing. No farewell show, no injury report, no scandal. Just silence. She had vanished. Ethan sat back, heart rattling with a mix of disbelief and curiosity. Why would someone walk away from that kind of future? Why abandon a gift so rare? And more importantly, why hide it? The next morning, Camilla was setting the breakfast table when Ethan entered the kitchen earlier than usual. She didn't flinch, but he noticed the pause in her hands. "Come with me," he said simply. He led her to the back study this time, smaller, more personal. The room where he used to read to Lucas when he was a toddler, where he'd once danced, clumsily, with his wife on a rainy afternoon, to old jazz records. He placed his phone on the table, the article open on the screen, her photo staring up at them both. "I want the truth," he said. Camilla looked down, then up again. Her eyes didn't show surprise, just fatigue, the kind that comes from holding something in for too long. "So you found it," she said quietly. "I want to hear it from you." For a moment Ethan thought she might walk out, but instead she pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down slowly, as if setting down the weight of her past. "I was 12 when I first fell in love with movement," she began. "Not dance, movement. My grandmother used to sweep the kitchen with music playing, her hips swaying like she was casting a spell on the dust. That was where it started." Her voice was low, thoughtful, not dramatic, not rehearsed. It didn't feel like a confession. It felt like truth unraveling. "By 16, I was performing in small theaters. By 18, I was on stage in front of thousands. I didn't have a life. I had a schedule, routines, diets, choreography. Everything was calculated." She paused, folding her hands. "But I loved it. God, I loved it. It gave me meaning, purpose, until the day it all collapsed." Ethan said nothing. "There was an earthquake," she said. "Not where I was, but back home. My family lived in Belo Horizonte. My little brother, Tiago, he was 10. He used to come to every rehearsal. He'd sit in the wings and mimic my moves with a goofy smile. He was my shadow." Her voice cracked. "The quake hit in the early morning. A gas line exploded. The building collapsed." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. Camilla stared past him as if seeing something only she could. "I wasn't there. I was in Lisbon, getting ready for a showcase. I didn't even know until hours later. My phone was full of missed calls. By the time I landed, he was already gone." She took a deep breath, but it shuddered in her chest. "After that, music hurt. The rhythm that once moved me, it felt violent, loud, crashing. I tried to return. I really did. But every time I stepped onto a stage, I saw him in the corner, smiling, and I couldn't move." She looked at Ethan then. "So I walked away." Ethan sat in silence, the weight of her story pressing into the walls around them. "I didn't come to Europe to escape dance," she said. "I came to escape myself." He didn't know what to say. How could he? There was no fix for a loss like that. No strategy, no logic. Just the terrible echo of what should have been. "And now?" he asked gently. Camilla smiled, though her eyes were glassy. "Now I dance in private kitchens with boys who've forgotten how to laugh." Ethan swallowed hard. "Why help Lucas?" he asked. "You could have stayed quiet. You could have stuck to your job." "I tried," she said. "But the first time I heard him hum a melody, something inside me moved, something I thought was dead." She paused. "He doesn't talk much, but his body speaks. The first time I offered to show him a basic step, he followed like he'd been waiting for someone to ask." Her voice softened. "And I saw myself, at his age, all that feeling trapped inside with nowhere to go." The room fell into silence again. Ethan rose, walked to the window and stared out at the garden. A breeze rustled the leaves. Somewhere in the distance he could hear Lucas's voice, faint, laughing. He turned back. "I've spent years trying to give him everything," he said. "Tutors, therapists, structure, control." Camilla tilted her head slightly. "Maybe he didn't need all that," she said. "Maybe he just needed someone to see him." Ethan met her gaze. "And what about you?" he asked. "Do you want to dance again?" Camilla looked surprised. She exhaled slowly, her answer quiet but certain. "I already am." That night, Ethan didn't return to his office. He didn't check his emails. He sat on the edge of Lucas's bed after dinner and asked a question he hadn't asked in a long time. "How was your day?" Lucas looked at him with cautious curiosity. And then he answered. That's how it began, not with a dramatic shift, but with a simple conversation that felt bigger than any deal Ethan had ever signed. He was beginning to understand something Camilla had known all along. Healing didn't happen in silence. It happened in movement, in rhythm, in connection. And sometimes it started with a single step. The courtyard had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. But Ethan Moreau saw it. Not in the hedges or the stonework, which remained immaculately groomed. Not in the sun, which still spilled across the cobblestones in golden sheets every morning. No, it was in the energy. Something vibrant lived there now. Something that hadn't existed in his home for years. And at the center of it was his son. Lucas had started dancing regularly with Camilla. At first it had been quiet, spontaneous, a few minutes stolen after homework, an improvised step during chores. But now it had become something else, something intentional. Discipline had taken root. Ethan watched from a distance at first, arms folded across his chest, posture stiff. He told himself it was parental oversight. But even he knew it was more than that. He was drawn in, by the rhythm, by the dynamic between the two of them, by the way Lucas moved. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. More than once, Ethan found himself leaning in the doorway longer than he intended, mesmerized by the boy who not long ago had spoken in nods and shrugs. Now Lucas moved with focus, with curiosity, with the subtle defiance of someone reclaiming a part of himself. Then one evening, as the last light faded over the lake and the house settled into its usual hush, Lucas came to him. His hair was damp with sweat, his cheeks flushed from practice. He stood in the library doorway, hesitant but determined. Camilla told me about a youth art showcase, he said, in Florence, in 6 weeks. Ethan set down his tablet and looked at his son. I want to audition, Lucas said. For real, not just practice anymore. There was no trembling in his voice, no uncertainty. It caught Ethan off guard. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he gestured for Lucas to sit, and the boy sank into the leather chair across from him. You think you're ready? Ethan asked. I don't know, Lucas admitted. But I want to try. And Camilla? She says I could be. Ethan exhaled and leaned back. There was a time, not long ago, when he would have dismissed the idea outright, but he'd watched too much change too quickly. He'd seen Lucas come alive in a way no tutor or counselor had ever managed to awaken. If this was the path forward, who was he to block it? If you do this, he said carefully, you commit. You give it everything. You work, you train, you learn what it means to finish what you start. Lucas nodded. I will. That night, after dinner, Ethan asked Camilla to join him in his study. He didn't say why, and she didn't ask. When she entered, he was already pacing. You really think he's capable? He asked without preamble. Camilla considered the question. I think he has the drive. The rest will come. He's still fragile, Ethan said. No, Camilla replied. He's still healing. That's different. Ethan paused. Her distinction felt sharper than he expected. He nodded slowly, then said, I want him to train like a professional. If he's going to stand on that stage, I don't want him humiliated. Camilla raised an eyebrow. Neither do I. Push him, Ethan said. Challenge him. I won't coddle him, she replied. But I also won't break him. The next morning, training began. It was no longer casual. Camilla arrived at sunrise, stretching out in the courtyard as Lucas stumbled out of the house, bleary-eyed but eager. Warm-ups, breath control, balance, drills that burned his legs, repetition that tested his patience. Ethan watched the transformation unfold. Lucas began to move differently. He was still learning, still awkward in places, but his determination had sharpened. When he fell, he stood again without complaint. When Camilla corrected him, he absorbed it without resistance. Camilla, too, changed. She became someone else during practice, firmer, quieter, deeply focused. Her movements were exact, her corrections measured. She no longer danced alongside him but stood slightly behind, observing, guiding, refining. And the more Lucas grew, the more Ethan began to feel something unexpected. He wasn't just impressed. He was proud. It surprised him. This feeling. It had been years since he'd truly felt it, and longer still since he'd allowed it to matter. But there it was, building quietly in his chest every time he saw his son rise from the floor stronger than before. One afternoon, Ethan returned early from a meeting in Milan and entered the courtyard to find Lucas standing alone. Camilla was off to the side, her arms crossed, watching. Lucas was dancing. Not rehearsing. Dancing. Freestyle. Improvised. He twisted and turned with raw intensity, his body moving in ways it hadn't weeks earlier. Not polished, but expressive. Powerful. "I call it the sky spiral," Lucas said breathlessly when he noticed his father. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't know what I'm doing, but I feel like I'm flying." Ethan smiled, a real rare smile. "Then keep flying." That evening, after Lucas had gone to bed, Ethan stood with Camilla in the garden. The night was cool. Crickets murmured in the distance. The lake glittered in the moonlight. "You've done something I couldn't," Ethan said. "You reached him." "I didn't reach him," Camilla said softly. "I gave him space to reach himself." Ethan looked at her. "Why does this matter so much to you?" Camilla was quiet for a moment, then said, "Because I never got the chance to finish what I started. Because no one ever told me it was okay to try again. And now, maybe, helping him helps me too." They stood in silence for a long time. In the weeks that followed, Lucas only became more devoted. He practiced after dinner, asked for feedback, read about dance history online. He asked Camilla to show him clips from her old performances, something she'd never shared before, and she did. Together they watched her glide across ancient wooden stages in South America, in younger days filled with light and promise. Lucas watched with awe. Ethan watched with something closer to reverence. Then, one day, something new happened. Lucas brought a friend. Mateo was a quiet boy from school, tall and stiff, who barely said a word. Lucas introduced him casually and offered him a bottle of water as they stretched. "You want to try?" Lucas asked, motioning to the makeshift practice mat. Mateo hesitated, then nodded. Camilla began teaching him the basics. Ethan, watching from the second-floor balcony, didn't move. His son, who once could barely face the day, was now inviting others into his world, helping someone else find their footing. It shook Ethan in the best way. That night, Ethan knocked gently on Camilla's door before she left for the evening. "Whatever happens in Florence," he said, "thank you. For everything." Camilla nodded, but her voice was quiet when she replied. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "The hardest part is still to come." She was right. But what none of them knew then was that the hardest part wouldn't be the dance itself. It would be letting go of fear. It would be trusting the stage, trusting the moment, and most of all, trusting that the boy who once disappeared inside himself was ready to step out and be seen. Florence loomed closer with each passing day, and the rhythms inside the villa began to change. Gone was the lightness of discovery that had once filled the courtyard. In its place came discipline, routine, sweat. There was no more laughter during warm-ups, no pauses to admire the view or improvise a spin. Now there was only the sound of the metronome, the beat of determination. Lucas trained relentlessly. Each morning began with muscle stretches and breathing drills. Camilla guided him with unwavering focus, no longer simply a mentor but a coach with high standards and sharp eyes. Her tone was never cruel, but it was firm, expectant. She saw something in him, and now he was starting to see it in himself. But progress wasn't linear. For every breakthrough came frustration. For every clean turn, a stumble. One afternoon, the air sticky with late summer heat, Lucas missed a leap he had nailed 3 days before. He landed too early and collapsed to his knees. Camilla stood nearby, arms folded, expression unreadable. "I'm never going to get this," Lucas muttered, his voice thick with tears he refused to shed. Camilla walked over and crouched beside him. "You've done it before." "Not when it matters." Camilla studied his face. "What do you think matters?" Lucas looked away. "That I don't mess up. That I don't embarrass myself. That I prove something." "To who?" she asked gently. The question lingered. Lucas didn't answer. That night, after Lucas had gone to bed, Ethan found Camilla alone in the kitchen, wiping down the countertops with slow, methodical movements. "He's pushing too hard," Ethan said. Camilla didn't look up. "He wants to be ready. He's 13. He's also grieving." Ethan leaned against the doorway. "I thought this was about healing, not pressure." Camilla turned to face him. "Healing isn't easy. It's not soft. Sometimes it's painful. Sometimes it's showing up when you don't want to. Ethan exhaled. He doesn't know how to handle failure. Neither do you, she said softly. The words hit harder than she intended. Ethan didn't reply right away. He stepped into the room, pulled out a chair, and sat across from her. I know what it feels like, he said, to want to control everything, to plan for every outcome. But nothing prepares you for watching your child fall apart. Camilla met his gaze. Maybe falling apart isn't the worst thing. Maybe it's where we begin again. In the days that followed, Ethan tried to step back, to let the process unfold without interference, but he couldn't help noticing the tension growing in his son. Lucas's movements grew tighter, more calculated. His eyes lost some of the spark they'd held just weeks before. He wasn't dancing anymore. He was executing, replicating. Camilla noticed it too. After one particularly rigid session, she called for a break. Lucas sat on the ground, panting, avoiding her eyes. You're thinking too much, she said. I'm trying to be perfect. That's not the point, Camilla replied. You don't win by being perfect. You win by being present. Lucas stared at her. What if that's not enough? Camilla crouched beside him. It's more than enough, but you have to believe it. Ethan watched from the doorway, a sense of helplessness creeping in. He had always believed that preparation guaranteed success, that planning could prevent pain. But this was different. This was emotional exposure. It required something far greater than practice. It required surrender. 2 weeks before the showcase, something unexpected happened. Lucas asked if Mateo, his quiet schoolmate, could join a practice. Ethan was surprised. Camilla was not. Mateo showed up on a rainy afternoon, shoulders hunched, hands tucked into oversized sleeves. He barely spoke, but Lucas welcomed him in, handed him a towel, and walked him through a basic stretch routine. Camilla watched silently. Ethan, observing from upstairs, felt a flicker of awe. Lucas had become the teacher. He was patient, encouraging, gentle. He didn't correct Mateo's form harshly, didn't laugh when he slipped or faltered. He simply repeated, "Try again." The sight undid Ethan more than he expected. It was leadership, yes, but it was also something deeper: compassion. That evening, as Ethan stood outside Camilla's room, he didn't knock immediately. He waited, hands in his pockets, listening to the wind rattle the olive trees. When he finally entered, she looked up from a book. "He's changing," he said. Camilla nodded. "He's growing." Ethan hesitated. "I thought dancing would just give him something to focus on, a hobby, something to fill the void." "It's doing more than that," she said. "It's giving him a voice." Ethan looked down. "I missed so much." "We all miss things when we're grieving," she said gently. "But he's not asking you to be perfect. He just needs you to show up." Ethan nodded. "And if he fails?" Camilla closed her book and stood. "Then he fails with dignity and gets back up." The final week before the trip to Florence was intense. Lucas woke early, trained hard. He pushed past fatigue, frustration, fear. The routine was no longer just memorized. It was embodied. But beneath it all, Ethan could see the nerves mounting. The night before they left, Lucas barely touched his dinner. Ethan sat beside him, pretending not to notice at first. Then, quietly, he said, "Talk to me." Lucas looked up, surprised. "About what?" "What's going on in your head?" Lucas hesitated, then whispered, "There's a boy in the showcase, Santiago Beltran. He's won the last 2 years." Ethan nodded slowly. "He messaged me," Lucas continued. "Said I didn't stand a chance." Ethan's fingers tightened around his glass. He took a slow breath. "And what do you think?" he asked. Lucas stared at his plate. "I think maybe he's right." Ethan leaned forward. "Let me tell you something. People only try to shake you when they feel you might actually be a threat. You made him nervous. That's why he came after you." Lucas looked up, his eyes wide. "He came to break your focus," Ethan said. "Which means you've already gotten his attention. Now all that's left is to prove why." A smile tugged at Lucas's mouth. Not wide, not loud, but real. "I'll try," he said. "No," Ethan replied. "You'll dance. Let the rest fall where it may." That night, before bed, Lucas stood in front of his full-length mirror and practiced the opening gesture of his routine. He didn't speak. He didn't fidget. He just breathed. And somewhere deep inside him, he began to believe, not that he would win, but that he belonged. The air in Florence was heavier than usual. Perhaps it was the weight of anticipation, or maybe the late summer humidity hanging over the hills. Either way, as the crowd began to gather outside the open-air amphitheater, something palpable buzzed in the atmosphere. Families filed into rows of curved stone benches, murmurs of expectation bouncing through the air. The stage, nestled against the soft blush of the Tuscan sky, was set. Lights glowed beneath tall arches, warming the wooden floor that dozens of dancers would cross before the day was done. Backstage, Lucas Moreau sat with his elbows on his knees, hands clasped so tightly they were beginning to turn red. Around him, other young dancers paced, stretched, whispered choreography to themselves. Some were serene, others bristling with nerves. Lucas stayed quiet. He had rehearsed every day for 6 weeks, knew the routine forward, backward, upside down. Yet now, minutes before his name would be called, doubt crawled its way up his spine. Not doubt in his preparation, doubt in himself. What if I'm not enough? He closed his eyes and tried to remember the first time he danced with Camilla. The laughter, the freedom, the moment. It wasn't about performing, but about feeling. He tried to summon that again now, but the noise inside his mind drowned it out. A hand touched his shoulder. Breathe. Camilla stood beside him, calm as ever. Dressed in black, her expression was focused but kind. She didn't give him a speech. She didn't list reminders. Just one word. Breathe. He inhaled slowly, exhaled. Again. Then he nodded. Out in the crowd, Ethan sat in the third row. He wore a dark blazer over a navy shirt, but it wasn't the clothes that marked the occasion. It was his stillness. Ethan Moreau, a man who had spent his entire life in motion, moving, planning, controlling, now sat completely still. He wasn't here to fix anything. He wasn't here to guide, to analyze, or to win. He was just here to witness. The announcer's voice broke through the tension. And next, representing Lake Como, Italy, Lucas Moreau. There was a polite wave of applause, then silence. Lucas stepped out onto the stage. The lights hit him, hot, blinding. For one terrifying second, he couldn't hear the music, couldn't see the audience, couldn't feel his feet. But then, he saw two things. Camilla, just behind the curtain, watching him with the quiet steadiness of someone who believed in him without needing to say it, and his father seated in the crowd, not with the stern expression of a man waiting for results, but with a softness Lucas had never quite seen before. A silent promise. I see you. The music began. A single cello note, low and deep, spreading through the air like a wave. Lucas moved, not because he remembered the steps, but because he let go. He let the music pull him across the stage like a tide. Every step was a question answered. Every turn, a release. The choreography was no longer mechanical, it was alive. It pulsed from his chest, from his fingertips. He wasn't reciting. He was speaking. The routine was designed to tell a story of loss and struggle and renewal. Camilla had helped him build it from pieces of his own memory. The loneliness after his mother's death. The silence that wrapped itself around him like a shell. The first time he had laughed again. The first time he had danced. And now, under the open sky, it all spilled out. The final movement arrived too soon. A leap, a turn, a spin that once left him sprawled across cold tiles. He braced, leapt. Time slowed. He landed. Solid, graceful, strong. The music stopped. For a moment, silence. Then applause. Not thunderous, not riotous, but steady, genuine. Camilla clapped, eyes wet. Ethan stood slowly, then brought his hands together. No words, just the thrum of his heart, pounding against his chest. Lucas stood in the center of the stage, chest rising and falling, sweat glistening along his brow. He looked out, not at the size of the crowd, but at the faces that mattered. He didn't need a medal, but one came anyway. Later, after a brief intermission, the announcer returned to the microphone. This year's first prize for technical performance goes to Santiago Beltran of Madrid. Predictable, polished, expected. Santiago walked on stage with confidence, bowed, smiled, but the announcer wasn't finished. We also wish to present a special honor. An award not for flawless form but for something rarer: artistic voice, vulnerability, and emotional depth. The Spirit of the Stage Award goes to Lucas Moreau. The applause doubled, louder this time. Lucas blinked, froze, then walked forward, the weight of the moment sinking into his limbs as a silver medal was slipped around his neck. The applause continued as he turned to face the audience. Ethan was on his feet, and for the first time since his mother died, Lucas smiled the way he used to, with no guard, no fear, only pride. Backstage, Santiago approached him while Lucas removed his shoes. "Not bad," he said with a smirk. "Didn't think you had it in you." He watched from doorways. He listened. He asked questions. He learned how to sit with discomfort. He learned how to show up, not with solutions, but with presence. And slowly Lucas began to trust him again. Then came the showcase in Florence, the moment that would test everything they'd worked for, not just technique, but courage. Could Lucas carry his story onto a stage? Could he dance not just for the judges, but for himself? Backstage, Lucas trembled, but Camilla gave him one word: breathe, and it steadied him. On that ancient wooden stage, beneath a sky painted in gold and lavender, Lucas didn't just perform. He testified. His body spoke in the language of sorrow and strength. He danced his pain, his healing, his hope. And when it was over, he didn't win first place. Santiago Beltran did. Polished, practiced, expected. But Lucas won something deeper. He received the Spirit of the Stage Award, given not for perfection, but for authenticity, for heart, for soul. And in that moment, as the medal hung around his neck and the applause surged through the air, he stood taller than he ever had before, because for the first time, he knew he mattered. Back at the villa, things didn't return to normal. They evolved. Ethan didn't see Camilla as an employee anymore. He saw her as a partner in the rebuilding of something sacred. He offered her more than gratitude. He offered her freedom. When the invitation arrived for her to teach at a youth arts academy in Tuscany, he encouraged her to go. Lucas understood, and more importantly, he didn't fall apart, because Camilla hadn't just trained him to dance. She had trained him to trust, to try, to carry on. Ethan had a studio built on the estate, not for competition, but for exploration, for creativity, for connection. Lucas used it every day, sometimes alone, sometimes with others. And as he grew, so did the space around him, filled with movement, with life, with love. Camilla found her purpose again, not by reclaiming her old spotlight, but by lighting a path for others. And Ethan, who had once believed control was the highest form of strength, discovered a deeper truth. Real power comes from presence, from letting go, from standing still when it matters most. The story of Ethan, Lucas, and Camilla isn't just about dance. It's about healing. It's about the courage it takes to feel again after losing something you thought you could never live without. It's about the people who come into our lives quietly, unexpectedly, and help us remember who we are beneath the armor we wear. Lucas's journey reminds us that joy isn't childish, vulnerability isn't weakness, and expression isn't indulgence. It's survival. For anyone who has ever felt numb or stuck or buried under expectations, his story is proof that movement, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, is the first step back to life. Ethan's evolution shows us that success without connection is a hollow victory, that all the power in the world means nothing if we forget how to be human. He learned that it's not enough to provide for someone. You must also see them. And in learning how to see his son, he finally saw himself. And Camilla? She is every person who has ever walked away from a dream, not because they stopped believing in it, but because the pain was too much to carry. Her story teaches us that even in exile, grace remains, that gifts never die. They wait, and when they return, they do so not to reclaim applause, but to heal. This story is not just fiction. It is a mirror. Maybe you are like Lucas, searching for a voice in a world that wants you to be quiet. Maybe you are like Ethan, so focused on surviving that you've forgotten how to connect. Maybe you are like Camilla, carrying a grief that no one can see, unsure if your light still matters. To all of you, this story says, you are not alone. The moment you begin again, even if your steps are shaky, even if your rhythm is off, is the moment you begin to heal. Because healing isn't a destination, it's a dance. You don't need a stage, you just need space. and someone to believe in you. So whatever you're carrying, fear, doubt, regret, set it down. Turn on the music. Move. One step, then another. And let the silence break. Because the moment you do, you'll remember you were never broken. You were becoming. And now, it's time to begin. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support gives us the strength to create more content that heals, uplifts, and inspires. Let's keep telling stories that matter. Let's keep dancing. Until next time, thank you for watching.